The Beaver College of Health Sciences is the newest college at Appalachian, and over the past decade we've seen exponential growth. And every year we have new programs, new faculty, new staff. Our students are expanding, they're growing in these programs, and this creates an energy that's palpable. You can really feel it. It's an exciting place to come to learn.
Take one look around the Leon Levine Hall of Health Sciences and you see a place that was built to take health to new heights. It is spacious and flexible and filled with light. And you take this building combined with the Holmes Convocation Center, and you're talking about two places that are packed with health science students and professionals who are friendly and forward-thinking and innovative.
The professors at Appalachian are special, and they are special because they care so much about us. They see us as human beings and not just some random student or a number in their classroom. We are people who they want to see succeed, who they want to invest in and share their knowledge with us and see us as future colleagues.
Our history runs deep, and I'm proud to be a partner with Appalachian State University and what we're doing here in Northwest North Carolina. The original investment, which we worked on together, Appalachian Regional Healthcare System and Appalachian State University, provided really a seed to additional projects that will transform what I believe all of Western North Carolina through not only educating students and the workforce of tomorrow, but also finding new ways to treat patients, to meet the complexities that we have here in healthcare, and then also creating wellness opportunities right here for the folks that live closest in this community.
I have had the pleasure of being here for 4 years, and I know that the first 2 years were a whirlwind because all I wanted to do was get into this program, to be sitting here in this uniform. That was my goal, and it was my dream. I ate, slept, and spent every waking moment striving to be here. So getting to be here and in the yellow and be one of the bumblebee students running around different hospitals is just really awesome.
So my future goals is to become a certified wellness educator and a nutritionist. The teachers here, they're so passionate. Either it's an anatomy professor, either it's a nutrition professor, healthcare management. They have done so much work, and with the way they teach, it's not like from textbook, it's from their own experience.
What makes us unique as a college is that we have all the different facets and departments of health. So you have the front porch to our college, which is health, physical education, recreation. Those all encompass quality of life matters and learning at young ages to be healthy and make good choices. And then as you move through our college, you have different departments, whether it's accessing health and well-being through public health, exercise science, social work, and then moving into our clinical side that looks at nursing, communication, science disorders, and understanding how setting yourself up to be a healthy person with a good quality of life. And then if you need the clinical side, you can do that as well.
I absolutely love it here in the college. The unique experiences that I've gained here and the friends that I've made in the relationships, the strong relationships that I've built with my professors has really kind of cemented what I want my future to look like. And I feel like without the college, or even without this space even, I probably wouldn't have the same views or the same optimism towards my future that I would otherwise.